Welcome to Non-Toxic. I'm Daniel Penny. On this episode, we're going Hollywood. The past few weeks have seen a flurry of lawsuits connected to the cast of It Ends With Us, a new movie on Netflix about domestic violence, adapted from the 2016 novel of the same name by Colleen Hoover. Maybe you've come across social media chatter about the allegations: sexual harassment, inappropriate on-set behavior, and a coordinated PR campaign to destroy the reputation of the film's leading actress, Blake Lively. This is a sort of thing that I'd normally skip, but I started following the story more closely because of who is being accused. Author, actor, director, and self-declared feminist ally, Justin Baldoni. Listeners may know Baldoni as the co-host of Man Enough, a podcast which, quote, explores what it means to be a man today and how rigid gender roles have affected all people. The show is co-hosted by music producer Jamie Heath, who's a producer on It Ends With Us, and he's also in Hot Water, along with journalist Liz Plank, who has now publicly stepped away from the podcast, so I don't want to tar her with the same brush. Lively's account of Baldoni's behavior was laid out in an 80-page letter filed on December 20th with the California Civil Rights Department, and it became the basis for a New York Times investigation. After that article was published in late December, Baldoni then announced a lawsuit of his own against the New York Times. Baldoni is seeking $250 million in damages. And since recording this episode, Baldoni has also now sued Lively. If Lively's account bears out in court, it's going to, I think, be in the Southern District of New York. The story illustrates how problematic the idea of the vocal male feminist has become. And if Baldoni wins, it may be the final nail in the coffin of Me Too. To understand what the situation means and how it may unfold, I'm here with Emily Kirkpatrick, former contributing editor at People magazine and Vanity Fair, and author of the weekly newsletter about fashion and celebrity, I Heart Mess. And joining us is Dr. Will McInerney, whose research focuses on gender justice, men, masculinities, and violence prevention. Thanks for coming on the show, Emily and Will.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for bringing us together, Daniel.
So this first question is for Emily as a celebrity expert here. Can you give our listeners who perhaps haven't watched Gossip Girl a quick primer on who these people are?
Wow, yeah, that's a big question. Yeah, Blake Lively, kind of teen actress, teen superstar, then went on to have a long film career, married to Ryan Reynolds, who many people probably know as Deadpool. Yeah, a pretty high-powered A-list celebrity, and Justin Baldoni, star of Ugly Betty, I would say is probably his big claim to fame. And then, of course, yeah, producing films, his feminist podcasts, and many TED Talks on the subject. And of course, both co-stars in It Ends With Us, a film about domestic violence that was not exactly promoted as a film about domestic violence, which is one of the many issues involved in these lawsuits.
So maybe we should start there with the promotion of the film. The movie came out this summer. It was quickly kind of overshadowed by this controversy around what fans believed was a kind of like a botched promotion of the film, that it was discussed in inappropriate terms. And yeah, I'd like to hear a little of your takes on both of that, kind of how it was that the film was positioned in the discourse and why people started reacting to it negatively.
Yeah, before we kind of got into the problems with the discourse around it, the initial problem was that a story came out in the Daily Mail in the beginning of August, I believe, that would basically reported on trouble on set, big egos, big attitudes, kind of actors having to pick sides between the two of them. But at the time, it was still like relatively unclear, maybe who was to blame or what specifically had happened or what specifically had caused this rift in the cast. But following that report, fans began to notice that, a lot of the cast members did not follow Baldoni on Instagram, which is always like a big tip off in celebrity reporting. Social media follows kind of weirdly mean everything. They noticed that he was absent at a lot of the premieres, or even when he was present, the cast was refusing to take photos with him, which is incredibly unusual for the star of a film, let alone the director as well of the film. And so from there, yeah, it started kind of spiraling out, and largely people were picking on Blake Lively. I think, and for a large part because of how she was promoting the film, which people did genuinely find to be distasteful. As she wrote in her own lawsuit, like, she wanted to really focus on her character's resiliency and strength and how she had overcome the situation, while Baldoni wanted to focus on the domestic violence issue specifically. And that was a point of contention between them. And I think fans and the audience definitely noticed the difference between those two approaches to the coverage, and they preferred Baldoni's ultimately, which kind of played into maybe what she is alleging his crisis PR team was helping to bolster in the public, or like a sentiment against her.
Will, I'm hoping you can maybe chime in here. I'm curious about that distinction, and this applies to, I think, texts and films more broadly, this idea of when violence against women or intimate partner violence is represented on screen, and the sort of competing demands to either like center the survivor and their overcoming of this trauma, or to more explicitly focus on the violence. How do you see people in our current moment navigating that, and where do you think It Ends With Us sort of fits into that paradigm?
Yeah, it's a real challenge. And Emily kind of laid out the two opposing perspectives there, or differing perspectives, I should say, which is because I don't know that they're necessarily always opposing. And I think this is a hard subject matter, and using this subject matter as a way to create a form of entertainment through film is a challenging and sensitive process. And you're going to end up not being able to please everyone. You're going to end up to potentially do harm. And this is a real issue that comes up a lot in my work. So a lot of my research looks specifically at the use of arts to engage boys and men in gender equality, violence prevention. And there's some real benefits. We have a ton of research that shows us the real power of using film, of using podcasting, of using the creative industries as a way to engage more men in these conversations and to deepen that engagement, to use the power of creativity and storytelling. But at the same time, for many of the reasons for why that work is effective from an educational perspective, it can help convey a more emotional, a more personal, a more visceral connection to the subject matter. That can also do harm. That can also be challenging for folks who have directly experienced this form of violence. That can be challenging for folks who have friends or family members who are caught up in violent situations. And so I guess I would say is I don't think there's a particularly right answer here. Film, art in general, is a powerful medium. It is not intrinsically a good medium or a feminist medium. It is a powerful way to communicate these subject matters. And the fact that within one film itself, you had differing perspectives on how to tell that story, I do think speaks to some signs that there were real clear challenges within the cast itself on what was the point of this film, and were they doing it in a way that minimized harm.
I think that's a really interesting question. Yeah, that these creative differences perhaps were intention sort of from the start, and that there wasn't really. It seems like they weren't resolved by the time the film was rolled out for promotion.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, in watching some of the interviews, it does seem like they were certainly on a different page in the way they were communicating this. What is the source of those differences and those tensions? Perhaps we will see play out in these lawsuits.
So competing promotional strategies slash kind of like narratives around the film, and how that divide then shifted into something more explicitly like anti-lively. That because I remember coming across these posts myself on Instagram and just on social media, old clips of Blake Lively talking with a Swedish journalist, I think it
Yes.
was, and acting really testy. And I was noticing what seemed to be an organic trend of people turning on Blake Lively essentially, and saying like, clearly she's the problem, she's a bully, she's a diva. And
Yeah.
yeah, like how did that unfold?
Sure. I mean, to begin with, I think, like Will said, neither strategy, neither approach to promoting this film was necessarily the wrong one. But I think because of that stark difference between, it wasn't a unified front for how the whole cast was addressing it, that people kind of immediately picked up on Blake's lack of attention, I guess, or lack of emphasis put on victims of domestic violence, which obviously, made many people kind of upset, or they felt that she was ignoring kind of the core issue at play in the film. And I think from that moment on, it kind of opened up a door for people to be like, when else has she been insensitive? When else has she, or maybe treated interviewers unkindly over the course of a very long career, right? And it also just kind of plays into, I mean, this is what social media loves to do, right? Like dig up receipts, cancel people, find dirt. It's like it's fun for the public, I think, to take down stars. We just saw it kind of happen with Jennifer Lopez, right? Like we've noticed this pattern increasing and increasing in recent years of kind of like bringing up every old receipt, every bad thing everyone has ever done, whether they're famous or not. Honestly, it's the same as like searching through someone's old tweets till find something you disagree with or a controversial take and then pulling that to the forefront as though it's still their opinion today or still their behavior today. So yeah, I think that's kind of how it does. And I think that, according to Baldoni, his hiring of this crisis PR team was kind of like preemptive. Like he knew that, or he believed that Blake was going to put forward her narrative of what had happened, which we now find out was a narrative of being sexually harassed in the workplace. And he wanted to get in front of it. And many of those texts that were published in Blake Lively's complaint kind of frame it as they wanted to. He includes a specific tweet about Hailey Bieber that's like a thread, a history of all the times Hailey Bieber has bullied other women to bolster a claim that she was currently bullying Selena Gomez. And he said, this is what we need. Like, this is what I want. So I think he kind of already knew the trend of like how society likes to take these things, saw it kind of unfolding naturally. And I wouldn't be surprised to learn that his crisis PR team just played into that more heavily. I mean, even non-crisis PR team, even traditional tabloid media, like that is how they operate. Like if they see the kind of zeitgeist going a certain way or feeling a certain way about celebrity, they'll absolutely mine that for all the contents and click that it's worth. So yeah, it doesn't really surprise me.
In Lively's complaint, one of the PRs hired by Baldoni texts her colleague how, quote, socials are really ramping up in his favor. She must be furious. It's actually sad because it just shows you how I guess she wrote have people, but I think meant to write how people really want to hate on women.
Yeah.
So I want to take a moment to discuss that quote because I think it's clearly tapping into much larger issues in the zeitgeist, pre-existing tropes about women in Hollywood, women more
Absolutely.
generally. And it's like, why are we still falling for them? And also, just notably, like Baldoni's PR team, it's the same team, right, that worked for Johnny Depp during
Exactly.
the Depp Heard lawsuit. We just saw this, and yet,
Exactly. And you're talking about a PR team who knows very well that the public hates women, especially like rich, famous, powerful women. And they absolutely know how to play into that because as we saw it happen with the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial, exactly how they played that and incredibly successfully, like incredibly successfully skewed the public and social media in favor of their client. And so, yeah, they know how to do it again. Why do we keep falling for it? That's a great question. I mean, you already see it even with Blake filing this complaint. The amount of misinformation I've seen shared just about the nature of her complaint and like the legitimacy of it out there is crazy by like very much non-legal experts, media experts who are just kind of knowingly or unknowingly doing the bidding of Baldoni's PR crisis team. I also just think it comes down to kind of we keep falling for it. I mean, one, our media literacy, our understanding of how this stuff works is very, very low. I've found in the work that I do. A lot of what I talk about in my newsletter is literally just how celebrity PR strategies work and how, they manipulate the public through images or narratives or source quotes or whatever. And I am constantly surprised by just how little the general public knows about how that really operates behind the scenes and the amount of misinformation
If I can jump in there, I think another
Yeah,
reason
please.
why we keep falling for it is because we're primed to, and because the same
Mm,
norms that these PRs professionals may be tapping into are strong and still deeply held, and those norms are around not believing women, and those norms are around deeply entrenched gender roles from a patriarchal standpoint. And while, yes, there are some positive trends, if we look at research over the past few decades, there are some positive trends in men's engagement with feminism and gender equality. Recent studies have also showed, kind of complicating that narrative a bit. I think UN Women put out a study in 2022, and King's College London put out one earlier last year, 2024, both showing that younger men were less inclined to believe feminism was doing good and indicated that it might be doing harm, that younger men were more likely to hold stereotypical beliefs rather than older men. And of course, now all of this is to say, like, men as a whole have net negatives across the board. Women are the ones that are continue to advance feminism and gender equality, but that older men are more pro gender equality than younger men. And I think this, yeah, not to go too far down the rabbit hole, but this also aligns with, the emergence of the manosphere and things that you've talked about in previous, where young men are getting a lot of their information. And so a PR professional, I'm often confused why they're even needed for these sorts of things. I feel like the society and the culture is natural gasoline. All they have to do is toss a match onto the fire that's waiting to be lit.
Yeah, first of all, we've totally been primed to, like, do this stuff for ourselves and, like, you know, decades of PR people have made us our own, kind of amateur PR people. And then also, I mean, the reason we fall for this again and again, like you said, it's like what it's incredible social media content, right? It's like everybody's talking about this, everyone wants to go viral, everyone wants to be an influencer. And because we already have these types of biases inherent in society, we have the manosphere, we have these young boys primed in this direction, it's really easy to capitalize off that, right? It's really easy to tell a narrative that feeds into that and then enhances your own fame, your own virality, even if you're wrong, even if it's just for a moment, like who's coming back to fact check you? And who fact checks, social media people at all? Even when they are acting as legitimate reporters, legitimate news sources, legitimate gossip mongers, what have you. You're incentivized to pretend you're an expert, right? Like you're incentivized to log onto the internet and act as an authority or speak authoritatively, even if that's not the case.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that the kind of gamification of the commentary on a case like this encourages people to gin up the most insane conspiracy theories, the
Yeah.
most, provocative and ridiculous things, and they're not going to really face any blowback, but they might go viral. They might get a lot of followers out of it,
Yes.
and no one is questioning their bona fides. Speaking of bona fides, I want to talk about Justin Baldoni's bona fides as a feminist. He's certainly not the first self-proclaimed male feminist, but I was hoping, Will, maybe you could talk a little bit about how he fits into the kind of larger history of men taking up the cause of feminism. You mentioned earlier that the appeal of feminism for men has really like receded, at least for younger men, Gen Z in particular. But I think there are still probably some advantages that Baldoni can wring out of it, and I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about kind of how he's positioned himself and what that lineage looks like.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we could talk for hours about the history of men and feminism, despite there not being that many of them. There's enough to fill a podcast or two. But to give a quick history, kind of thinking about the U.S. context where Baldoni is based, you know, there is a long history of some small groups of men supporting the gender equality effort, supporting suffragettes, supporting feminism. But it's important to contextualize them as small in number, and that these movements have, as I noted before, been led by women and non-binary folks, and they continue to be. But over the course, of the past 50 years, there has been a growing response to feminism from men, and folks like Baldoni are a direct response, are a direct continuation of that movement. It started kind of more focused around political activism. It kind of pivoted towards an intellectualization of the movement, and then in the 90s and onwards, we see kind of what they call the professionalization of men's feminism. Now, there are some good aspects of the professionalization, meaning that more and more opportunities to do this work full time. You see the NGOization of engaging men in gender equality. You also see the rise of a lot more gender-based violence prevention work, but you also see the emergence of celebrities who benefit from the professionalization, who use their platforms to talk about these issues. And I think Baldoni is very much squarely in this third cohort around using his professional career, using his platform to speak about these issues. And to be clear, Baldoni's got some influential TED Talks with millions of views. He's got 2 books and a podcast, as he noted, that has a lot of quality content that deals with these issues in nuanced, in important ways, and in accessible ways. And we certainly know from the research that role modeling is a powerful way. Male role models can be a specifically powerful entry point for other men and boys. And folks like Baldoni, as he frames his own role, seeks to utilize his position to try to do some good by role modeling a different way of being a man, by challenging these rigid norms. Now, how did that play out? And there obviously, we're here talking today because there have been some very serious allegations that have been made against him. And, I don't know all the facts of the case, and we'll have to see how it plays out in court, but it's good that there is a meaningful form of accountability that is being sought.
More of my conversation with Emily Kirkpatrick and Will McInerney in a moment. Non-Toxic is sponsored by Blue Corn Candles, a Colorado-based company making only the finest beeswax candles. They burn clean, smell great, and most importantly, they're not made with any petroleum products. You can use the code NONTOXIC20, capital N, capital T, to get 20% off your first order. Now, back to my conversation with Emily and Will. Within feminist spaces, how is Baldoni perceived?
There's a split camp, and there are many feminisms, so I don't mean to homogenize them all, but there are some feminists who have openly, actively sought to welcome men into the feminist movement because feminism, as Bell Hooks famously wrote, is for everyone, and feminism benefits everyone. And there's a very strong, powerful, positive case to make there. But there have been some other feminists that have been a bit more weary that men would take up too much space in feminism, that men would make feminism about them, that they would be put into the spotlight too much. And so while everyone wants everyone to work on it, whether men get to claim feminism or to become professional feminists has been a point of debate because of some of the concerns that are being highlighted here. Men who embrace feminism in 2025, while they are challenging their own privilege in some way, they are also gaining a new form of privilege for certain groups of people. They're gaining some social capital in certain circles. And I think Baldoni is a great example of he very effectively used that to, support and advance his career. I'm sure he also lost some fans in the manosphere, but I bet he explicitly gained some specifically for these stances he was taking. I don't know Justin, and I don't mean to imply or to understand his motives. Hopefully he was doing it because it's the moral and it's the right thing to do. But feminists have been quite skeptical of men for these reasons. And within the field, it's sometimes called the pedestal effect that men get, or the glass escalator, which is that when a man declares himself to be a feminist, he immediately rises to the top. He immediately gets a microphone put in front of him, and he immediately gets all of a sudden paid opportunities to talk about what is often doing the bare minimum, what is often doing things like basic childcare or agreement in principle or in theory that gender equality is a good idea. And then all of a sudden, those men are greeted with awards and with more speaking time. The MACtivist.
So Baldoni did just have his award taken away. His most recent.
Devastating.
True. And unfortunately, Baldoni is not the first. And so, feminists, again, have been skeptical for good reason for a while, because there is a track record of men claiming feminism, of men benefiting from feminism. And then years later, it comes out that they didn't always practice what they preach, that they weren't holding themselves necessarily accountable. And accountability is another big issue that gets thrown around a lot in the space within the research field, but also within the activist space. Men like to be accountable in the abstract. They like to think about accountability, but they don't like to define accountability, and they don't like to specify who they are accountable to. And I think, and I believe in Baldoni's own TED Talk, he talks about the importance of listening to women when they say that you've done something wrong, the importance of being accountable to the women in your life. Again, he said a lot of the right things. How this pans out moving forward is yet to be seen. But to answer your question, to come back to your question, which is that Baldoni is very much a continuation of a long line of men who have tried to engage with feminism, and I think for good reason. And he put out important, compelling content that probably did engage people who were otherwise less interested. But it's important to be critical. It's important to be skeptical. And while there is a debate around, can men be feminists, or should they just be feminist allies or pro-feminist? I tend to fall on the idea that men can be feminists. I think we can all be feminists, and feminism does benefit people of all genders. But I think men should have a particularly high bar, and it should not be about claiming an identity. It's not about a label that you get to pin to yourself and benefit from. For all people, but for men in particular, because we still live in a patriarchal world which privileges us, you have to earn your feminism. Your feminism is defined through your actions, and you don't get to build up a bunch of credit. Well, I did a whole bunch of good stuff last year, and I wrote these 2 good books 3 years ago. Every day you wake up in a patriarchal world that privileges you, whether you want that privilege or not. And so every single day you have to re-earn your status as a feminist. And I think that's a better system for accountability, which kind of is maybe a different kind of blueprint for moving forward.
Well,
I also just think it's possible to, for men to engage with feminism and to champion feminism without necessarily making feminism a part of their brand. That's kind of always where I become wary, when it's, I don't know, monetized, or it helps center themselves in the narrative, or furthers their own kind of public profile. That's always kind of when, the red flags go up for me.
so since the New York Times article came out, as we discussed at the top of the show, Baldoni has now announced that he is suing the New York Times. And I thought, Emily, it would be good to turn to you here to talk.
Sure.
We talked a moment about accountability, I think in a sort of more personal sense, but now we're going into the realm of legal accountability.
Yeah.
And, I've been on the receiving end of some overinflated lawyerly language
As
myself
have
as
I.
a reporter.
Yes.
I figured you've probably been there many times.
Sure.
But yeah, when I read that quote, I was like, they're swinging for the fences here. So what is it that they're really arguing happened in the New York Times reporting? And what is it that they're asserting? And why aren't they countersuing Blake Lively?
Great
That
question.
was very confusing to me.
Yeah, great questions. I think all very intentional, all very strategic. The technical allegations against the New York Times are libel, false light invasion of privacy, promissory fraud, and breach of implied in fact contract. I am not a lawyer, so I'm not technically informed on what all of that exactly means, but I do know that they're going to have a really hell of a time proving libel in America. They're going to, the First Amendment alone, I think, is going to immediately put that to bed. It's filed in California. There's a lot of anti-SLAPP laws in California that kind of prevent against stuff like that. They're basically laws designed to protect free speech and kind of a necessary legal grandstanding that's intention is to quell public discourse about it, which to me, I think an argument could be made that that is what Baldoni is doing with a lawsuit like this against the New York Times. Again, as you said, not against Blake Lively. Why is it against the New York Times? I don't know. For one, my kind of suspicion about why it's filed against the New York Times is to make a kind of a niche legal argument that, Blake has filed a complaint while Baldoni has filed a lawsuit. And I've already kind of seen some of that play out on TikTok and social media, people making that distinction, even though I don't know, I don't want to get too in the weeds, but basically for Lively to file a lawsuit against Baldoni and Wayfarer, she has to file a complaint first in the state of California, because the complaint is the precursor to getting a letter to sue, basically from California, where she can
And
then
she
file
has
the
since
lawsuit.
filed a lawsuit in
She
the
has
Southern
since
District of New
filed a
York.
federal lawsuit in New York City, in New York State.
Yeah.
So that's a different lawsuit. Well, it's the same lawsuit, but in a different state. And that was filed directly after Baldoni filed against the New York Times, which makes me wonder, again, if it's actually the language of lawsuit, like they want to be able to use that word in all of these press articles about it versus like Blake has filed a complaint, which would in 60 days lead to the filing of a lawsuit. But also,
Fascinating.
I think it's because Baldoni disproving what she's claiming about sexual harassment is much more difficult, right? Because it's kind of he said, she said. Blake seems to have a lot of witnesses to a lot of these events. She seems to have a lot of support from the cast, from her castmates, from even Colleen Hoover herself, who was working with Baldoni for years before Blake even came on board this project. It just seems like a much more difficult uphill battle, and it's ultimately going to make him look bad, kind of no matter what, you know, to argue against a woman's perspective and a woman's experience of these types of events. And yeah, I think it's just kind of splashy to sue the New York Times. I don't think
Mm.
it's gonna kind of result in anything except maybe him having to pay some fees, honestly. But yeah, it's kind of ill-conceived as well because I don't know, just knowing how fact-checking process works for this type of stuff, having done it myself, and especially at a place like the New York Times, which I would imagine would be incredibly stringent, incredibly by the book. They have entire legal departments, they have entire fact-checking teams. And as you can even see in the original article they published, they have a statement from Baldoni's lawyer. So they did reach out to him for a request. And in that request, they made no mention of the fact that these text messages that they were publishing were, according to Baldoni, doctored or taken out of context or completely misleading. It's like that would be something that you would address in your initial statement to the newspaper then when they asked for because they would have the New York Times would have like given them a list of like, here's all the allegations Blake Lively is making against you. Here's like all the evidence we have. You can rebut one by one, or you can give them kind of a blanket statement. You can give it on the record, you can give it on background. But also, we find out following the filing, the New York Times didn't just review Blake's filing itself. They reviewed the original documents, is what they said. They said they poured through thousands of pages of original emails and text messages fully in context. So that to me, and they quoted all the things verbatim as they appeared. So I don't know. You're going to have a really hard time proving libel with stuff like that.
To me, the best move for Baldoni is to become part of the manosphere at this like,
For
to
sure.
me, that's the genius move, and, like, suing the New York Times is the first step
Yeah.
in
Classic
that,
pivot.
because then he becomes a champion of free speech who was, maligned by rabid feminists who had gone too far, and he's a reasonable man who's become a victim of our insane cultural moment. Like, couldn't you see that?
100%. I
Chess
can
move?
see that. That is a classic PR strategy for like quote unquote canceled men. That it is repeatedly kind of pivot to Manosphere, pivot to Joe Rogan. I mean, like, look at what Army Hammer is doing currently, going on these kind of like podcast rounds to re-ingratiate himself after like a year or two of absence. I don't know. Yeah, I think that's kind of 101.
Though usually those stars aren't quite as explicitly labeled feminists as
That's true.
Baldoni. Will, you look like you have something to add to that.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say is like maybe I'm being too optimistic, which is something that's been said to me more than once. But I hope that doesn't happen because of the depth of the his contributions to men and feminism, and again the multiple books, the long standing podcast. It was on for at least a few years, and regular
Yeah.
production that he has spoken out about this with a good level of nuance and passion and personal anecdote, which isn't to say that, you know, all of that could have not lined up with his actual personal life. Again, I don't know what's true or not there. But I do think he's distinct in that he has shown a multi-year commitment, which isn't to say that it can't be undone. I'm hopeful that that's not the outcome that comes here, but rather that, as in many cases, this is challenging work and perhaps he did not live up to his own ideals. Now, if that is true, then there's multiple ways forward in better path forward would be to seek accountability and change and growth.
What are the ramifications of an event like this? I'm thinking in terms of like how films like this get made and rolled out around, a serious issue of domestic violence. Is it just going to be that no one is going to want to make a film about domestic violence for a while because it's a subject that's been tainted?
But yeah, I mean, I hope that the lesson would be like more stringent HR, like more intimacy coordinators, more maybe therapists or mediators on set. Like I hope that the lesson would kind of be protocol and like employees based, because I highly doubt Hollywood's gonna stop making movies about domestic violence. It's very sensational. They like topics like that. It gets people to in the theaters. So yeah, I don't see them avoiding it, but hopefully maybe just kind of mitigating the type of damage or the type of communication that goes on set, hopefully. And I think what's going to be really the fallout from this is like culturally how we talk about this stuff, how we talk about women's experiences on set. As always, I think women are going to kind of take the brunt of this. And, Blake Lively happens to be very rich and powerful and so is able to speak up for stuff like this, as, Amber Heard did. And I think the lesson from kind of both of these is like it kind of doesn't matter who you are or the access you have or the power you have, like the public will punish you for speaking out or for telling your side of the story. And I think that's very scary.
Yeah, I certainly agree. I hope the lesson isn't to not share these stories. I think these stories are powerful, and when the folks who have created them and the folks who have experienced them want them to be told, I think those stories should be told. I think the lesson is to do it better. Like the lesson is to learn from the mistakes. That's not an, you don't get an excuse. You don't get to be let off the hook when you make mistakes, but to use mistakes as an opportunity to do it better. Because I do think the arts, film included, are a powerful and important and perhaps a necessary way to do the hard work of engaging more people in these conversations, of reaching people where they are. There are so many folks who are going to go see a film who wouldn't otherwise pick up Justin Baldoni's book about feminism, or who wouldn't otherwise pick up a bell hooks book about feminism, who wouldn't listen to a podcast explicitly about these sorts of issues, that thinks critically about gender equality and masculinity, but who would go see a film at a theater with actors that they recognize. And if I can add one more thing that I hope comes from this, which is, again, role modeling is really powerful. And Justin Baldoni was a powerful role model. I also teach programs with men around engaging them in feminism, and I've heard his name. I learned who Justin Baldoni was from teaching groups of men who mentioned him to me, and I had to go do my own research.
Wow.
He was reaching people. He is reaching people. And so I do think that role modeling effect is powerful. It does work. But I am wary of elite role models like celebrities, without, again, presuming what actually happened in this case. I think we rely too much upon celebrities and people like politicians. Yes, they can play a specific role, but I think within the kind of the professionalization of engaging men in feminism, for which I am a part of said movement, I think we need to lean more into peer role models. I think we need to lean more into immediate figures in folks' lives, parents, coaches, teachers, community leaders. I think that's where research shows us we have a deeper, more meaningful engagement. Yes, folks like Justin Baldoni can spark someone's interest, but they're more likely to change and be transformed and to think critically about their own life and their own masculinity and their own role in preventing gender-based violence or promoting gender equality from people who look like them, who live in their community, and who they can actually interact with. So yes, we need elite role models, but more importantly, we all need to be better everyday role models.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I look forward to whatever future lawsuits these two file.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And that's it for this episode of Non-Toxic. As always, I'm your host, Daniel Penny. The show was produced by Loose Thread Studios. Our music is by Nathan Sharp, and our artwork is by Sam Creasy. Non-Toxic is sponsored by Blue Corn Candles. If you'd like to support Non-Toxic, you can go to patreon.com/nontoxicpodcast and sign up to become a member today. You can also follow us on Substack, we're on Instagram and Twitter if anyone is still there. And we've got some exciting news to share soon, but I can't go into exactly what it is right now. So suffice it to say, big things coming soon, watch this space, etc. I think we're going to do one final episode for this season, maybe a wrap up with our old friend Andrew Lewis. So stay tuned for that, and yeah, keep detoxifying.